You guys read the title. These are 5 players that I am not drafting. These guys have a really good chance of ruining your chances at winning a league this year. And a common theme we're going to talk about in this video that you have to understand is that you cannot draft players at their ceiling. You also have to understand that we're not going to be drafting players that are good in real life. We're drafting players that are going to be good in fantasy. I don't care how good Saquon Barkley is going to be on the Eagles. If he doesn't catch passes, he's probably not going to produce. And if he was going as the first overall pick, it wouldn't be a shot at him to say that he's a bad pick. So again, this isn't me calling these players bad players. They're just bad picks in fantasy. Let's move on. The first is Chris Olave. He was the wide receiver 19 in points per game, which was very questionable. He had 140 targets last year. He had 1,100 yards with those 140 targets and only 5 touchdowns. And that was on a year where Derek Carr played pretty good for Derek Carr. He was top 10 in the majority of passing statistics in the NFL. So I think we would be a little bit crazy to expect him to do that again. But on top of all of that, Olave is being drafted as the wide receiver 11. He's never finished that high, even in points per game. Not to mention, he's been hurt every year of his career so far. I think wide receiver 11 is his absolute ceiling, and that's barring no injury or anything that happens to him in the offense. I think taking him this high is a little bit ridiculous. I would take him as my wide receiver 15, but this is just too high. The next is Malik Neighbors, and it's the same philosophy here. Is he a great player? Yes, I loved him at LSU. I think he'll be an elite top 10 receiver in the NFL one day, but that's not going to be this year. Not with Daniel Jones at quarterback. Everything else is bad for him too. We've seen this with Garrett Wilson in recent years where he had Zach Wilson in horrible quarterback play and he still reached 1,000 yards, but going into last season, he was a horrible pick. Obviously, Rodgers got hurt, but the situation is similar to what we're dealing with in New York with Malik Neighbors right now. On top of having Daniel Jones as his quarterback, the offensive line is horrible. They have no run game. The defense is bad, and they're pretty much just tanking for a quarterback. So it's even worse than the situation that Garrett Wilson had at the Jets, because at least Garrett Wilson had Breece Hall to take away some of the defensive attention away from him. I wouldn't be surprised if we see CB1s guarding Malik Neighbors and they also bracket him, because if you're an opposing defensive coordinator, he's the only thing you have to game plan for. The third guy is Sam Laporta. Again, he's a great player. He'll probably be an all-pro for the majority of his career, and I think the Lions were a great landing spot. That doesn't change that he's going as the tight end 18th overall in fantasy leagues right now. This guy going in the second round is ridiculous. He had 800 plus yards and 10 touchdowns last season. How much better can he even get? They're not going to use him how Travis Kelce's been used in years past, so I don't think 1,200 yards and 13 touchdowns is his upside. I think we're drafting him at his ceiling again. Plus, Jameson Williams was named as the most improved player in this offense by Dan Campbell. Jahmyr Gibbs should get more work in the receiving game, and they just paid Amon-Ra St. Brown top 5 wide receiver money. He's not going to go anywhere. I just think on an offense like this, where there's so many great pieces, you can't have a tight end have a Travis Kelce type season, and that's where he's being drafted. I prefer Travis Kelce this season over Sam Laporta, and he goes 10 picks later. I prefer Trey McBride and Kyle Pitts over him too, and they go 20 picks later. I think it's just a young player hype situation with Sam Laporta, and he is very good, and he'll be very good for very long, but there's no real reason to take him this high in fantasy. The next guy is Brandon Ayuk, who just requested a trade today, but there's no way in hell that I am going to be drafting him in fantasy football. He had over 1,300 yards last season, getting 105 targets. Jacoby Myers had more targets than him last season, and that was with Deebo Samuel injured for a chunk of the season, and then they just added in Ricky Pearsall. Not to mention, he could very well be traded to a team like the Steelers, who have Arthur Smith as their offensive coordinator, or he could go to another team like the Patriots that have no quarterback set up right now. Obviously, if he went to the Commanders, that would be pretty good, but really, what is his upside on a team outside of the Niners? The teams that could trade for him are like the Chargers, the Commanders, the Patriots, the Steelers, maybe like the Packers, and all of those teams are good teams, and I wouldn't mind him being there from a dynasty perspective, but for this season alone, him having to go to some new team right now in July, learn the entire playbook, and be behind other receivers or be incorporated into an offense doesn't sound very good to me. If he stays a Niner though, I still think he's a bad value at his current draft capital, because he had an efficiency season like we've never seen before last year, and like I said, Deebo Samuel's coming back. George Kittle should be involved again in this offense. Obviously, you have Christian McCaffrey, then you add in Ricky Pearsall. I don't know how Ayuk is supposed to live up to this 1,300 yard, top 10 wide receiver season, because it's just not in his cards anymore. And the last guy I'm not drafting is Saquon Barkley. Well, not the last guy. There are more guys I'm not going to draft, but that's for another video. And the thing is with Saquon is it's just like Sam Laporta. It's just like Brandon Ayuk. It's just like Malik Neighbors and even Chris Olave on some level. Like, these guys are all good players. They just don't have the situation that I want for fantasy football. And I think people taking Saquon Barkley at the end of the first round think that he's going to have a Christian McCaffrey bounce back when he went to the Niners, and that's just not what's going to happen here in Philly. I think Saquon will be good. I think if he's fully healthy, he will probably have 1,300 yards, 10 touchdowns this season. But is he going to catch any passes? Absolutely not. Jalen Hurts doesn't throw the check down pass ever. He just takes off and runs. And when they get inside the 5-yard line, they're doing the tush push. So his goal line work and red zone carries are probably going to be very minuscule. Not to mention, Saquon Barkley's been very injured his entire career, so I don't know why we're taking a guy at his ceiling in that situation when he could very easily miss 2 or 3 games and no one would be surprised. Like, what happens if Saquon Barkley averages 80 rushing yards a game, 2 catches a game, has a touchdown every other week, finishes the season with, 1,100 rushing yards, 8 touchdowns, but he only plays 14, 15 games. Like, that's a huge disappointment in fantasy football, especially for a guy that you're taking in the first round. When you can get guys like Derrick Henry and Kyren way later, you should just do that. Because in my mind, a guy like Derrick Henry is locked and loaded to get all the goal line work on a great offense, and he'll probably have just as many rushing yards as Saquon's gonna have this year. So again, the concept here is not that we're taking guys at their ceiling. We want to take them at a reasonable price where they can actually increase over value or exceed our expectations. And I think everybody that I mentioned today probably can't do that. There's other strategies that we're gonna go through, and I'll make a video on all the little nooks and crannies that you have to understand about fantasy football when you're actually drafting, because there are so many things that happen during the live draft, in the process leading up to it, and prepping your team in terms of roster setup that you need to do if you really do want to have a great fantasy team this year. But those videos will be coming out soon. Tomorrow I'll be posting a video about my top 24 wide receivers and tier lists for them. So make sure you guys are looking out for that.